Hi, welcome to Queen of the Ring, the podcast that wants to talk to you all about wrestling. My name is Alexa.
Vince McMahon has always had this mentality about treating wrestlers like circus animals. All these wrestlers that have broke their backs making this living for years end up with nothing when it's over. And then they sort of take you out back and they put a slug in the back of your head and dump you out. That's the life of a professional wrestler.
But I just don't think people really realize how bad I've been hurt. I guess you look at people on television and you watch them and just people, they seem indestructible. And it's just kind of a hard thing a hard concept to grasp.
Many hotel rooms, I have just sat there, and I call it the silent scream. It's just, I don't know why. You just sit there, and tears will just come down, and you just sit there, and fucking hours, man. Hours. Because there's no answer. There's no place to turn. And when you do turn, who cares? You're just a dumb professional wrestler.
Today I'm going to be republishing an episode that I recently put out last week all about labor rights within professional wrestling. The first time around, there was a lot of audio issues, so I'm so sorry if you listened and had trouble listening, and I'm sorry if you did listen, and now I'm just putting out the same one, but I wanted to redo it, and I think as a curse for wanting to redo that, I got a cold, so my voice sounds a little different than it usually does, but I'm not gonna cough in the microphone or sniffle or anything silly, so I hope that you can enjoy this as much as possible. So, as I just said in my preamble/warning, a lot of this episode is going to be discussing a brief history of labor rights in wrestling, unions in the United States, very brief there, and an explanation of independent contractors, but ultimately, we find out just how damaging this system has been and can be to the wrestlers that work for billion-dollar companies like the WWE. In 2019, a journalist, Eric Cohen, made up a list of many wrestlers who had passed away in the last few decades. This list was over 100 people long, and he reminded the reader that they're not dying of old age. They're dying of other issues, heart problems at a very young age, too young, or drug misuse problem, or issues with their mental health or mental well-being. And all of this, of course, is very worrisome, especially to people that love and appreciate this sport for what it is, and therefore love and appreciate these wrestlers. But I'm gonna get started within all of this nitty-gritty, because there's a very long history since the dawn of time with power and abuse of power within labor conditions. People have been exploiting others for their labor by wielding, power over them forever. And also, even though it's happening for so long, we only have to turn our history pages back, 100 years and very much less to remember historic examples of the need for unions and protection of workers' rights. And something that comes to mind easily for me is the Triangle Fire, where all of those many young immigrant women lost their lives because they were working in incredibly dangerous working conditions. And this was in the early 1900s. I'm sure many people learned about it in school. And many people who are put in dangerous conditions like this are people who are marginalized or underrepresented in the history of the United States. People of color, Black people, Indigenous people have been fighting for fair labor rights for a very long time, and there is a long history of unionization and solidarity between people of color and working-class white people, especially throughout American history that I know of. And I don't want to bore people with, history about the United States for too long. But something that's important to this story, I think, is that basically in 1939, the distinction between independent contractors and employees became particularly important because Congress enacted the National Labor Relations Act, and this was enacted to protect the rights of employees because this would protect them from abusive management, and it gave them the right to form unions. And when it comes to what is now known as modern professional wrestling, many of the venues where it would take place and grew from were circuses, burlesque houses, theaters. And from these different spheres, and of course a lot of other spheres, the people there became the promoters for the alliances and rivalries that were to form within the wrestling industry. Something to keep in mind, since this is an episode about workers' rights, I think, is that because many wrestling promotions evolved from circus shows and acts, and as I just said, many promotions came out of those places and those spaces, we all know that the treatment of circus performers throughout history is nothing to be proud of. Maybe there is something to the connection of that history and the proliferation of that history to being the treatment of performers nowadays. Maybe it's still being viewed in the same way somehow. I don't know, it's just an idea. I'm not a carnival barker, I promise. For the first half of the 20th century, the different promoters all over the US were operating regionally for the wrestling business. There wasn't much official designation. The competing promoters kind of agreed to help each other, but they were definitely still helping themselves while doing so. But this all began to change in 1948 with Waterloo, Iowa as its setting. It was July 18th of that year, and the pro wrestling top dogs met in a hotel room and created what they called the National Wrestling Alliance, the NWA. Each region would cooperate and quote-unquote share a world champion who would travel to these different territories performing. And they did this because at that point in time, many of these promoters were having issues retaining their talent, and they were trying to avoid these bidding wars with other promotions that were starting to happen with their talent. The promoters knew that they could make money if they, quote, agreed to share headliners, unite around a single champion, fix the wage scales, and blacklist any wrestler who refused to toe the line. All of my sources are linked below, I want to let you know. And these rules that were formed by the now NWA was likely a violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. And the promoters were aware of this, but they knew that they could probably get away with it, so they started the NWA, and the territorial era of wrestling was at an all-time high. The National Wrestling Alliance was successful and thriving until about 1963, when Vince McMahon Sr. decided to rock this boat heavily. Being in the National Wrestling Alliance, McMahon's earliest form of the WWE was the WWWF, the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, and they were dominating northeastern territories. And because of this domination, Vince decided he did not want to share his champion with the other territories anymore. This champion at the time was Buddy Rogers, the Nature Boy. And Vince christened him the first national champion, which made the other promotions' world champions look kind of weak and boring in comparison. And it was a move that Vince made to grasp greater power. Because there was a power in television that was untapped previously, of course, with the television becoming much more available for households. But because of televised wrestling, it was shifting the way that the territories had designated their wrestlers, where they put them. Because it was much harder to see a wrestler on TV one night in one state, and then when they would randomly show up to this other state in this other territory, it would become kind of confusing for the audience, and Vince McMahon Sr. picked up on that and took advantage of it. I'm going to jump forward about 20 years, because in a criminological research study, this Liverpool-based college wrote that as time went on and Vince McMahon Sr. relinquished the company to Vince McMahon Jr. in 1982, there was a very dramatic change in the wrestling industry. Through television, co-opting, buying, and deregulation, Vince Jr. marketized, commodified, and monopolized the business that was handed down to him. Over 2 decades, Jr.'s monopolization of this previously deeply rooted forest resulted in just one big tree, and that was the WWF. Within that same study, one researcher quotes, "The story of professional wrestling is the story of American capitalism." And I think this kind of applies to what we're going to be getting into later, which is the mistreatment of these workers. And I think it's because capitalism encourages, bosses and people who are making the majority amount of money to hoard that wealth and to treat their employees like shit because of it. And I don't want to get to cultural studies, to anti-racist work, but I do want to get to anti-racist work, of course, because in American capitalism, the theme that stands true is holding up the conventions of white supremacy. Because within white supremacy, there is a real anti-collectivist root. It's within both capitalism and white supremacy. But also something that is ingrained in white supremacy that affects this, I think, and something to keep in mind while we go out through this, is that work ethic and the perfectionism that it instills in people. Because it resides in rhetoric wielded by white supremacists, that the idea that you work through your pain, you work through anything. Because if you can stand, you should be working. And I think that ideology is put into many different facets of our everyday life as Americans probably the world over, because white supremacy is a disease. But I just think that it's something to keep in mind, and I don't think you should take my word for it. If you just look up white supremacy 15 components, or the 15 conventions of it, I think, or if you look up white supremacy work ethic, you'll be able to read different, philosopher studies and ideas. You don't have to take my word. And I just wanted to mention this because there are these greater forces at hand sometimes within these structures that we participate in, and it's just something to think about, I think. But to get back to my main storyline, by the end of the 1980s, Vince Jr. would successfully deregulate wrestling in some states. And because of the deregulation, the WWF got out of paying taxes on their broadcasts and were relieved of any oversight by some state athletic commissions. And the state athletic commissions do a whole lot in sports. Wrestlers, promoters, and referees, when they're in a state that's deregulated, aren't going to be licensed in those states either. And the deregulation makes it so there was no requirement for wrestlers to have even physical examinations before events. Some of those same criminologists that are cited in that article I'm reading from explain that the business has always been a very dangerous and harmful one to be in, of course, as combat sports, but that from the late 80s, there was and has been an extreme spike in wrestler premature deaths and a kind of linkage to the deregulation of the business that Vince catalyzed. Everything is affected by deregulation. The hours worked, the amount of rest, medical insurance, literally everything. And for example of this kind of weird work that the WWF was doing with the United States government, in 1997, the New Jersey governor, Christine Todd Whitman, was flanked by the popular wrestler The Undertaker, who signed into law a bill that recognized professional wrestling as entertainment, not as a sport. This removed the state's regulatory authority over the profession. And I think that when we look at this now, we all know saying wrestling isn't a sport is like a very unpopular thing to say nowadays. At least I don't think amongst wrestling fans it is, because wrestling is a fucking sport. For another example of deregulation, an article written in August of 1988 talks about how, although wrestling and boxing had been regulated in the state of Texas since 1933, athletic commissions began to insist that wrestling was different from boxing because the outcome is predetermined. But they said that boxing should still be regulated by the Texas Department of Labor and Standards because of the injury and death danger. But just because there is a lower rate of CTE and death risks in wrestling, I don't think it takes away from the fact that many professional wrestlers have suffered and do suffer from CTE, and the cases are higher than that of football, and football is regulated as fuck. And as of 2019, I want to let you know that 11 states have it deregulated still. Professional wrestling, I mean. So as deregulation was being promoted by the WWF, the monopoly was growing significantly. As wrestlers have historically been labeled independent contractors while they moseyed their way through the United States territories, they would work for multiple promoters in different states, and this would take place at Mid-South Wrestling to World-Class Championship Wrestling, Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, and many, many other promotions. This same label would maintain, independent contractor. This is what Jesse Ventura says about that label. Quote, "All through your wrestling career, remember, you're an independent contractor. You're paying out enormous amounts in taxes. There's no pension, no health benefits. And the moment you're not making that draw, the promoters couldn't care less about you. You're a piece of meat. I knew guys that had worked hard for 20 years or more and still retired with nothing. Wrestling operated under some of the most unfair working conditions in the country. I don't know how they got away with it for so many years." And as this monopoly got bigger and bigger, the contracts themselves that these wrestlers were signing became thicker and thicker. The wrestlers never became employees of the company that some worked at for 15 years. And in that criminological research study, it says it's crossing a legal boundary as it is a worker misclassification. The range of protections and benefits afforded by these laws are countless, this study says. And they include, quote, employer contributions to employees' families, health insurance plans, Social Security and Medicare contributions, unemployment assurance, workers' compensation, benefits protection from discrimination, and productions from wages below the statutory minimum. And from what the WWE has demonstrated as a company and what many people who worked there said, it seems many of those things are necessarily needing to be watched, even outside of bodily safety, but like racism within the workplace, sexual harassment and assault, work environment hostility, all of those things have been problems there, which like an HR department, which would really fucking help. And I'm not going to bore you too fucking far within this but there is a few ways that our country tries to determine who is an independent contractor and who is an employee of a company. I'm only going to say this for 1 second. I promise I'm not going to get too far into it. The IRS, in order to make this distinction, have the courts applied what is known as the right of control test. And the IRS devised and disseminated it. It's 20 factors. When I looked at all 20 factors personally, I saw that 16 of those indicate that WWE wrestlers specifically are not independent contractors, but are employees. And I link the test in the sources. If you want to look for yourself, you can look over it and decide what you think and come to a number on your own. But basically, I say all of this to get across the point that the WWE has a very, very, very clear advantage when they list their workers as independent contractors. So going forward in this episode, I want to get into a few stories of the people who state, allege, or say that they were taken advantage of. There are many more stories that I'm not going to get into right now, but I hopefully want to get into in a future episode of the same idea, because there's so many things to talk about within this huge umbrella of a topic. So these people either tried or did speak out about unionizing or protecting themselves. Something that I find when I write these episodes on topics, like rather than individuals, is that I tell a lot of stories about men wrestlers and more briefly mention women's stories. And I just want to say that's because so many of the women whose stories are out there is a person I hope to cover on this podcast and do very detailed episodes on. But I just want to say, the WWE and many other wrestling promotions are equal opportunity offenders. They will fuck over anybody. So, having quoted him earlier, I first want to get into the story about Jesse Ventura attempting to start a union at the WWF in the 1980s. The way he tells this story is that it was only a couple of weeks before WrestleMania 2. The publicity was at an all-time high. The show was coming up, and the wrestlers themselves were in a very advantageous place. On Stone Cold Steve Austin's podcast, Jesse explains, quote, "I waited until there weren't any agents around. I stood up in the dressing room and gave a speech to the boys. If we go together and simply tell the media we are not wrestling unless union negotiators by federal law can come in and give us the opportunity to unionize, the people that turn on the lights in this building are union. They have to do it by law. It's in our favor. And then if we engage all the other guys to do the same thing, we could have a union in wrestling." And this impassioned speech ended and everybody went home for the night. And this type of strike that he is saying they should do has worked before in another sport. And it took place at the Boston Celtics 1964 NBA All-Star Game. Quote, "Hours before the game started, the players refused to play, saying they wanted a pension, athletic trainers on every team, improved working conditions, and they wanted better playing conditions. They brought in their reps, and Tom Heinsohn said that after demanding their needs be met, the commissioner met the demands of the players, and they ended up playing the game that night." So this idea that Jesse was, offering to his coworkers had precedent. It had happened before in the favor of the people who were demanding it, and it was almost 20 years before this. So after he went home that night and woke up in the morning getting ready to go back to work, he received, a personal phone call from Vince, and Vince McMahon said that he would fire Jesse if he ever did something like that again, and he read him the riot act. When Jesse was fired for the WWF for refusing to sell them the rights to Jesse the Body Ventura, the name, it led to circumstances to how Jesse just exactly found out who ratted him out to Vince. Because in 91, he sued the WWF's parent company, Titan, and when it was revealed in the courts that the WWF had lied about their wrestlers receiving a certain cut for the VHSs being sold, Ventura was awarded $800,000. But he was also offered the truth that Hulk Hogan ratted him out to Vince McMahon this very same night that Jesse pitched this idea to all of their coworkers. Hulk called Vince right up and told him exactly what Jesse was planning, which just shut him down immediately. But as we all know, after WrestleMania, Jesse Ventura transitioned into acting, and because of that, he receives retirement and healthcare from SAG-AFTRA, and he got what he wanted in the end. And I don't know, the way that Jesse talks about it now has some moments of shittiness, to me at least, because he says when he eventually came back to the WWE, he didn't want to help people who were, quote, too stupid to help themselves. But I don't know. When people are told what their objective reality is, I think it's really hard to look at it and think, I deserve better. I don't know, maybe I'm a self-loathing person in some ways, but I think that line of thinking is understandable. When your worth isn't looked at as important, you may not value your own safety or needs. Basically, the Hulk aspect of this all left for a very funny moment decades and decades later when his daughter, Brooke Hogan, of Hogan Knows Best fame, for those who know, tweeted out asking a question about whatever happened to unions for wrestlers. The people were very happy to point out to her who the real villain was. And I don't think it must have been a surprise because Hulk Hogan has repeatedly proved himself a racist piece of shit. So she must have not been surprised by it. In a 2003 book, looking back at the late 1990s WWF's cost benefits, that same criminological research journal quotes, "McMahon's enormous profits were and are literally unheard of in either the sports or entertainment industries. And while Wall Street may have applauded McMahon's cost controls, wrestlers were stunned when they learned how little of the WWF's financial pie was allocated to wrestler compensation, unquote. In a documentary called In the Ring with Luna Vachon in 2006, Luna expresses to a group of trainees that wrestling is the hardest industry in all of sports and all of entertainment separately. She goes on to say that she believes within the first 5 minutes of being on television, wrestlers should be given a SAG card, like everybody else, but they're not. And she says she does not understand why it has remained this way. And simply neither do I genuinely have no clue why they don't include them in this, because they're on television just like other actors. To move along, in 2008, wrestlers Raven, Chris Kanyon, and Mike Sanders sued WWE for cheating them out of the opportunities for healthcare and benefits. They claimed that the classification of WWE wrestlers as independent contractors is a misnomer, and the judge threw out the case only because the statute of limitations was up, which kind of fucking sucks, because it's like, no, I recognize this happened to you, it's just been a little too long now. Quote, Bleacher Report obtained a copy of Kanyon's 2002 WWE contract, and it is revealing the extent of the ownership the company claimed, reaching even into death. Clause 11.2 states, this agreement will be terminated by wrestler's death during the term with no further compensation to wrestler's heirs, successors, personal representatives, or assigns. Somehow even more fucked up than that clause is Clause 9.12c, that says the promoter cannot be sued or held accountable if the wrestler is seriously injured or dies, saying, quote, whether caused by the negligence of the promoter, other wrestlers, or otherwise. Whew. Pretty fucking rough. And these contracts that I am quoting from, that the WWE provides their prospective talent, is allegedly the size of a fucking phone book. Wrestler Rene Dupree was the first teenager to ever win a title in the WWE, and they state that the contracts are intentionally overwhelming. The first 100 pages sound ideal, but then the next 400 find a way to contradict the positives that just happened. You would have to hire a lawyer, who usually work by the hour, to read through this encyclopedia-sized contract, and that would cost the person so much money. And all of this, he alleges, incentivizes wrestlers just to sign the fucking contract. A lot of the empirical articles and studies I read were conducted in regards to WWF or WWE, depending on when they were written, of course, but there are other large wrestling promotions who benefit from a similar, albeit much smaller structure. The now defunct wrestling promotion Lucha Underground had notoriously problematic contract issues themselves. The wrestler Sunny Kiss talks about her and a few other experiences on Chris Jericho's podcast, where she says, quote, that contract issue with Lucha Underground was a nightmare. We were making probably $4,000 a year. We couldn't sign anywhere else at all, and there were times when I couldn't even pay my cell phone bill. Anything. Ray Fenix and Pentagon were one of the first to get out, and I was very happy for them, but I was one of the last. That's crazy. $4,000 in a year is so far below poverty, it's ridiculous that someone would have to get caught up in something like that. In regards to another promotion, in 2008, the wrestler Daphne sued TNA for multiple injuries she had received while she was on the show. It included 4 horrible concussions and a severely bruised sternum. From an article about Daphne that I have sourced, writer S. Bruce states, quote, it is common for TNA wrestlers to face pressure from management to take high-risk bumps and or work hurt. Indeed, rather than happily volunteering, it seems many wrestlers are talked into these dangerous stunts. And Daphne just wanted them to pay for the hospital bills, but it seems like TNA handled their employees' needs like shit. Or not their employees, sorry, their workers. Around the same time, Darren Aronofsky, the film director, made the movie The Wrestler. And it was in 2008, and he took the opportunity at these press conferences he had to speak about labor rights in wrestling. About it, he says, quote, "The problem starts with the fact that they're not organized and they're not unionized. There's no real reason why these guys aren't in SAG. They're as much screen actors as stuntmen, if not more. They're in front of a camera performing and doing stunts, and they should have that protection. Or even if they're not on TV, the ring itself is a theater. So they're not just screen actors, they're theater actors. They're performers. They should have health insurance, and they should be protected." And I couldn't agree with that more. Similarly to Daphne's story was the case of Mark Henry in the WWE. On SmackDown in the later part of 2011, he was working as a huge heel and he was being awarded with the top championship, the World Heavyweight title. Mark Henry suffered a severe groin injury during the December 12th, 2011 Raw filming. And the injury worsened a lot throughout the week after that, but he was still forced to compete. Jason Powell, who is the publisher of ProWrestling.net, reported, quote, "The majority of the creative forces in the company wanted to give Henry an easier schedule for a few weeks to let that injury heal. However, Vince McMahon is said to have made the call to book the title change and was described as being less than sympathetic regarding Henry's injury. This could be helped if there was a union. This would have been prevented." Because, hey, I definitely have no fucking expectations for Vince McMahon to care about his workers, but that's why the union is there, so they can force him to care, so no one's ever forced him to fucking care. And something that will infuriate every single person that is listening is that the fucking writers, the producers, the cleaning people, they all had insurance. On Bruce Pritchard's podcast, he admits that he was an employee for the WWE. His podcast host questions, "So the guy that writes a chair shot to the head has insurance, but the guy who takes the chair shot to the head doesn't?" Bruce Pritchard responds with such a dicky lie, like, "I never asked anyone to do that. He's such a fucking liar. He's such a little bitch. He doesn't know how to have a simple conversation with someone who is like lightly, gently challenging him." And I'm going to put the video below so you can watch it yourself. But it's very infuriating. In 2019, John Oliver did a segment talking all about all of this stuff, and I think it brought it to a lot of people's attention outside of the wrestling industry. He uses a lot of the stories that I used, and honestly, his video was a really big source for me, and it was helpful for me to kind of use as a jumping off point, and I do recommend watching it all the way through. And if you're a wrestling fan, but maybe someone you love doesn't get it or something, and you want to tell them about this, show them the video. It's very digestible, and it's important, I think. Another person outside of wrestling that has tried to do something to change is the politician Andrew Yang. He's made some statements about the need for unions, and he even went so far as to say if Joe Biden was elected, which he was, that he would probably have a way to force unionization, but I mean, he hasn't done that, but it seems really hard to do that, so I hope he hasn't given up. On November 13th, 2020, at 4:46 p.m., Zelina Vega, the WWE wrestler, posted on her Twitter account, "I support unionization." 10 minutes later, the WWE released this very popular, very talented superstar. Zelina was making more money on the streaming platform Twitch than she was in the WWE. And now she's back, so I'm not saying too much about it. And I hope she got a better deal, of course, this time around. But, I think that was kind of fucked. Because around this same time, 2020, the WWE announced that their wrestlers could not continue to profit from their names or likeness on these third-party websites I mentioned, like Twitch or Cameo or YouTube, which pay wrestlers very high wages and usually higher wages than the promotions they're at. They are taking, intellectual property over the characters, I guess, that these people inhabit, so they can't even fucking enjoy or make money off of their own name. On a much more positive side, in 2019, just before this last story I told you, Eve Riot Girls of Wrestling in the UK, apparently spearheaded by the owners, joined a fucking union. They joined Equity UK, and it was just so exciting as a thing to jump off of. They released a statement saying, quote, "We believe there are clear benefits for talent to be a part of the union, including accident insurance for talent injured at work, as well as public liability and backstage insurance. Union membership also provides confidential legal advice and support, even when the talent are working for promoters who do not recognize the union. Equity members have access to representation in contractual disputes, as well as getting help with tax and welfare guidance." That's so exciting to be able to have all of this support and for the owners to be the people who are doing it. I mean, damn. And I know it's outside of the United States, so it is different because we operate on such a different fucking weird, capitalist ventures, even with medical insurance. So I know it's different, but I think it's something so exciting that is a positive to be looked towards and take inspiration from. And as my most recent example, in May of this year, 2022, Sasha Banks and Naomi, who were the women's tag team champions at WWE, had a little bit of a problem that I think is sourced to labor rights. It hasn't been officially discussed by anybody who was there, and there are only really rumors that have leaked, so the information could of course change, but as of now, people have stated that this problem was over creative disputes with the management. Sasha and Naomi reportedly did not like the way that their title runs were going, and they wanted some say in the process. When they were told no, they walked out of the stadium, as they have the right to do. Their lack of control over their characters is a direct example of the hypocrisy of being an independent contractor while they are managed as employees. And when something like this has happened previously, like when Brock Lesnar or CM Punk walked out, for example, in the middle of a show, there were never any comments from the company made. But when Sasha and Naomi walked out before that show, that SmackDown, Michael Cole, the longtime WWE announcer, expressed just how disappointed he and millions of fans were in Naomi and Sasha for leaving. He said, quote, "They let us all down." And another announcer, Corey Graves, said that they were, quote unquote, unprofessional. And for the WWE to have such an opinion on them walking out off camera is ridiculous. The amount of unprofessionalism that the crowd has been exposed to over the years is literally incalculable. And rarely has an announcer ever talked about the wrestlers in that way, like they're children that owe us something. In a Wrestling Republic piece, writer Savannah Gall made a very good point in her article titled, "Honestly, Sasha and Naomi did not let me down." It was about the way that Black women's actions are treated in comparison to their white counterparts. Even in combat sports, Black women still have to refrain from being too quote-unquote aggressive. And the WWE has never put backstage beef on that sort of blast for the audience and fans to see, and by leaving them out to dry, they left Sasha and Naomi to be attacked. Because people online were saying horrifyingly racist, misogynistic, and disgusting things about these two women, and the company didn't defend them, even a little bit. They had nothing to say except for the disappointment. And I think that's a disgusting example of who they will protect and who they won't. And that's why unions would be helpful, because they would protect everybody, or hopefully the option would at least. And to get to the end, I know one company I've clearly left out of this conversation is AEW, All Elite Wrestling. And from what I know, and hey, I could be very wrong, but is that AEW isn't as transparent with their policies, and we don't really know anything that's going on in the inner workings. I know incredibly recently Tony Khan kind of started to open the door a little bit, but I know that they differ from the WWE and that they involve other promotions like Ring of Honor and New Japan, but they haven't really answered any clear questions. And that whole debacle with CM Punk, the Young Bucks, and Kenny Omega kind of showed the fans just how hazy that view is. And I'm just personally not tempted to trust billionaires. I don't know, it's just me. Even though I do think AEW is cool. And now, really, to get to wrapping it all up, I don't know. It seems that those who argue against labor rights within wrestling always say that it would quote unquote ruin the business. But these people never really go on extrapolating. So all I can do is assume their reasons. And I think that part of it is that they believe independent promotions, wouldn't be able to operate anymore. And they wouldn't be able to afford these things to create a union for their wrestlers. But, when I'm talking about this, I'm not talking about those promotions. The ones that wouldn't be able to afford it are not exploiting their wrestlers in the same way as these large promotions. And I don't know, but how can that not be compromised? There must be a line or a threshold that someone can meet, but But hey, listen. I am not here to solve this problem. I'm not in HR. I don't work for unions. I'm not an economist, an accountant. I'm just somebody who did a lot of research on this because I care about the folks that I watch on television almost 3 days a week. And another aspect that I can posit people think would happen with regulation is that it would inevitably come along and dissect the pieces of wrestling that are beloved. The unabashed recklessness and debauchery that can come from those inside of its chasm. And I don't know what else to say except but people deserve to be protected in their line of work. Maybe at one point it was different, but now with the WWE being an apex of a wrestler's career, this monopolization has virtually bled the meaning of independent contractor dry. It just doesn't make legal, moral, or ethical sense for these large companies to be taking advantage of their wrestlers the way that they have and still continue to. But hopefully, with advancements, this can change. I'm not sure. I don't know whether to be hopeful or be sad, but maybe there's something more with interventions and accountability that can be held, but I guess we'll see. I want to say thank you so much for listening. If you like the show and feel like it, leave it a little review and stuff. It's said to help a little, and I'm tempted to believe folks that say so. Thank you so much for listening. This is Queen of the Ring, and my name is Alexa Pruitt. I am the writer and creator, and the music is done by Kreider Dane at Helter Skelter Music Productions. And if you like what you hear, please join me again. Thank you so much.